This is an Audio Realms, Audiobooks Plus presentation of Elric of Melnibone by Michael Moorcock. Read by Jeffrey West. Dramatic introduction by the author.
And so the great emperor received his education. Learning his wizard's craft on the dream couches, where one might live 1,000 years in a single night, Elric was trained in the ancient traditions of Melniboné's sorcerer kings. No mortal could learn all there was to learn in a single lifetime, and thus it was that the lords of the Bright Empire conceived a means by which their sons might gain all their inherited wisdom, a wisdom of millennia. These sons, and sometimes daughters, dreamed the long dreams of Imria the Beautiful, the dreaming city. They made pacts with the great elementals of fire, water, air, and earth. In these dreams, while they lay upon the dream couches of the dreaming city, they consorted with demons, with angels, and with violent, desperate men, with cruel warlocks, powerful witches, and all manner of supernatural beings. In these dreams they walked with the denizens of hell, and made bargains with the lords of chaos, even indulged in compacts with the dukes and duchesses of law. In sublime terror they made love to the undying. With horrible joy they made war against the never-to-be-born. They explored the corridors of measureless palaces and wandered through unmappable landscapes without horizon or end. They journeyed beneath the earth into the lands of sunless crystalline beauty, where vast glowing rivers roared and strange unhuman beings ruled. They walked the moonbeam roads, the astral roads between the worlds. They fell into burning suns and froze on silver moons. They learned the histories of all their pasts and all their futures. In these dreams, no pain was unfamiliar to them. No pleasure went untasted. Dream followed dream. Knowledge was heaped on knowledge, terror on terror, and joy on joy. And by this means they learned their magic, their power over all men and all the forces of nature. They learned to summon great winds, to throw fire, to raise the waters, to break the very surface of the earth. They learned to destroy the living and to resurrect the dead. They learned to survive dangers no ordinary mortal might ever hope to experience and live. Not all survived. Many died on the dream couches, trapped in some nameless spell, victims of some voracious immortal, torn apart by unimaginable creatures, destroyed by some appalling force. Of course, no mortal brain could absorb so many experiences or hold so many memories and remain sane. And it was frequently argued that there were few sane emperors of Melniboné. Was Elric sane? Elric of Melniboné, son of Sadric, would never be certain of his own sanity, nor indeed of his own moral choices. These were questions forever in his conscious mind, filling his waking hours, just as the terrors and wisdom of his dream quests remained in his unconscious mind, to disturb his sleeping hours. Elric of Melniboné had received the most rigorous education of all. For almost every hour of his lifetime he had lived 10 years upon the dream couches. Those who saw a young man just reaching maturity could not possibly know, unless they had experienced it themselves, what an ancient, near immortal dwelled within. Yet in some ways, in the ordinary ways of the world, its certainties and its deceits, Elric was a young man. He had a young man's ambitions, a young man's ideals, a young man's need for spontaneous action, for love, and for adventure. Elric's dreams had not dulled his taste for life. They had taught him sorcery more than teaching him conventional manners. Though he had the courtliness and grace taught to all Melniboné aristocrats, Though his own stock of irony was not small, and his own powers of observation not minor, yet he was still an untried creature, whose vast, sorcerous power was balanced by his own moral uncertainties. Elric's dream quests were recalled as nightmares, the vaguest of disturbing memories, interruptions of the sleeping mind. But what he had learned on those quests remained: sorcerous and military arts of complex depth and variety, arts which something in him feared to use, for he instinctively understood their destructive power. When one day Elric's father died suddenly, brought low by deep melancholy and too many disappointments, having failed to reinvigorate an empire which had grown lazy with its own great might, Elric was forced to consider his inheritance. He was now natural successor to the throne of ancient Imrir, a responsibility he was not sure he could fulfill. And Elric was not the only one to doubt his own abilities. Some said he was not suited for the task, that he had deficient blood, impaired strength, weak eyes, and an unstable mind, such as marked earlier so-called silver emperors, the white-haired, crimson-eyed albinos whose strange condition marked them out in the long line of sorcerer emperors and empresses. Some, who supported another contender for the throne, said this silver emperor, who conversed with humans as if they were equals, who had human friends as well as alliances with demons, would bring the empire down. It was predicted, they said, though these predictions, when challenged, proved to be somewhat numinous. Elric's succession would cause the defences of Imrir to tumble, they said. He would allow the human hordes to flood in. These hordes had grown powerful and longed to sack the city of the Dragon Lords. They hated these lords who had ruled them for so many millennia. They longed to loot, to destroy, to rape. These voices warned that Elric was fated to be the very last of his ancient line, a prince of ruins and desolation. Even Melniboné's greatest power, the huge dragons asleep in the dragon caves far below the dreaming city, the dragons who dripped fiery venom upon their enemies, even these would not defend the bright empire against the threat of those nations they called the young kingdoms, the upstart nations of a new and changing world. Some of Elric's own party, often the wisest, argued that Melniboné had grown too certain of herself, too proud to make alliances with those who refused vassalage, too arrogant to call upon the emergent nations and respect them as brothers rather than clients. In her lofty pride lay the seeds of her own doom. Even as she rose to her greatest power, Melniboné was already facing destruction. But this was not talk Elric's enemies cared to hear. Rather, they blamed him alone for any dangers Melniboné might face. And they championed his cousin, the swaggering warrior prince Irkun, who promised them glory, who promised them new wealth, who promised them a kind of immortality. Irkun, too, had learned his sorcerous craft upon the dream couches, though not with Elric's patience. He saw that his power lay not in wisdom, but in strength. He placed all his ambitions in the blade of his sword. And so they schemed, these various parties, some for Elric, some for Irkun, some for themselves. There were those who loved their strange country as passionately as any patriot loved their country. There were some who cared little for Melniboné, but sought personal advancement. There were others who calculated the security of their nation and saw Elric as too weak to defend them while loving the man himself. Some hated him and his dependence on drugs to survive at all, yet revered his lineage as the true blood of ancient Melniboné. They would support him no matter what arguments were brought against him. Still others spoke of ridding Melniboné of kings and aristocrats and founding a fresh republic, as had once ruled the dreaming city. And all of these and more gathered at the great court of emperors to scheme behind their hands, to whisper of betrayal and support, of wisdom and folly, and plot the dominance of this party or that. Over all of them the young emperor must preside, with due ceremony and pride. Over all of them he must appear dispassionate and distant. And now there is no turning back at all. Elric's destiny has been forged and fixed as surely as the hell swords were forged and fixed aeons before. Was there ever a point where he might have turned off this road to despair, damnation, and destruction? Or has he been doomed since before his birth, doomed through 1,000 incarnations to know little else but sadness and struggle, loneliness and remorse, eternally the champion of some unknown cause?
It is the color of a bleached skull, his flesh, and the long hair which flows below his shoulders is milk white. From the tapering, beautiful head stare two slanting eyes, crimson and moody, and from the loose sleeves of his yellow gown emerge two slender hands, also the color of bone, resting on each arm of a seat, which has been carved from a single massive ruby. The crimson eyes are troubled, and sometimes one hand will rise to finger the light helm which sits upon the white locks, a helm made from some dark greenish alloy, exquisitely molded into the likeness of a dragon about to take wing. And on the hand which absently caresses the crown there is a ring, in which is set a single rare Actorios stone, whose core sometimes shifts sluggishly and reshapes itself, as if it were sentient smoke, and as restless in its jeweled prison as the young albino on his ruby throne. He looks down the long flight of court steps to where his court disports itself, dancing with such delicacy and whispering grace that it might be a court of ghosts. Mentally he debates moral issues, and in itself this activity divides him from the great majority of his subjects, for these people are not human. These are the people of Melniboné, the Dragon Isle, which ruled the world for 10,000 years and has ceased to rule it for less than 500. And they are cruel and clever, and to them morality means little more than a proper respect for the traditions of 100 centuries. To the young man, 428th in direct line of descent from the first sorcerer emperor of Melniboné, their assumptions seem not only arrogant but foolish. It is plain that the Dragon Isle has lost most of her power and will soon be threatened in another century or two by a direct conflict with the emerging human nations, whom they call somewhat patronizingly the Young Kingdoms. Already pirate fleets have made unsuccessful attacks on Imrir the Beautiful, the dreaming city, capital of the Dragon Isle of Melniboné. Yet even the Emperor's closest friends refuse to discuss the prospect of Melniboné's fall. They are not pleased when he mentions the idea, considering his remarks not only unthinkable, but also a singular breach of good taste. So, alone, the Emperor broods. He mourns that his father, Sadric the 86th, did not sire more children, for then a more suitable monarch might have been available to take his place on the ruby throne. Sadric has been dead a year, whispering a glad welcome to that which came to claim his soul. Through most of his life, Sadric had never known another woman than his wife, for the Empress had died, bringing her sole thin-blooded issue into the world. But with Melnibonéan emotions oddly different from those of the human newcomers, Sadric had loved his wife, and had been unable to find pleasure in any other company, even that of the son who killed her, and who was all that was left of her. By magic potions and the chanting of runes, by rare herbs had her son been nurtured, his strength sustained artificially by every art known to the sorcerer kings of Melniboné. And he had lived, still lives, thanks to sorcery alone, for he is naturally lassitudinous, and without his drugs would barely be able to raise his hand from his side through most of a normal day. If the young emperor has found any advantage in his lifelong weakness, it must be in that, perforce, he has read much. Before he was 15, he'd read every book in his father's library, some more than once. His sorcerous powers, learned initially from Cedric, are now greater than any possessed by his ancestors for many a generation. His knowledge of the world beyond the shores of Melniboné is profound, though he has as yet had little direct experience of it. If he wishes, he could resurrect the Dragon Isle's former might and rule both his own land and the young kingdoms as an invulnerable tyrant. But his reading has also taught him to question the uses to which power is put, to question his motives, to question whether his own power should be used at all, in any cause. His reading has led him to this morality, which, still, he barely understands. Thus, to his subjects, he is an enigma, and, to some, he is a threat, for he neither thinks nor acts in accordance with their conception of how a true Melnibonéan, and a Melnibonéan emperor at that, should think and act. His cousin, Irkun, for instance, has been heard more than once to voice strong doubts concerning the emperor's right to rule the people of Melniboné. "This feeble scholar will bring doom to us all," he said one night to Divim Tavar, lord of the Dragon Caves. Divim Tavar is one of the emperor's few friends, and he had duly reported the conversation, but the youth had dismissed the remarks as only a trivial treason, whereas any of his ancestors would have rewarded such sentiments with a very slow and exquisite public execution. The emperor's attitude is further complicated by the fact that Irkun, who is even now making precious little secret of his feelings that he should be emperor, is the brother of Cimmeril, a girl who the albino considers the closest of his friends, and who will one day become his empress. Down on the mosaic floor of the court, Prince Irkun can be seen in all his finest silks and furs, his jewels and his brocades, dancing with 100 women, all of whom are rumored to have been mistresses of his at one time or another. His dark features, at once handsome and saturnine, are framed by long black hair waved and oiled, and his expression, as ever, is sardonic, while his bearing is arrogant. The heavy brocade cloak swings this way and that, striking other dancers with some force. He wears it almost as if it is armor, or perhaps a weapon. Among the many courtiers, there is more than little respect for Prince Irkun. Few resent his arrogance, and those who do keep silent, for Irkun is known to be a considerable sorcerer himself. Also, his behavior is what the court expects and welcomes in a Melnibonéan noble. It is what they would welcome in their emperor. The emperor knows this. He wishes he could please his court as it strives to honor him with its dancing and its wit, but he cannot bring himself to take part in what he privately considers a wearisome and irritating sequence of ritual posturings. In this he is, perhaps, somewhat more arrogant than Irkun, who is, at least, a conventional boor. From the galleries the music grows louder and more complex, as the slaves, specially trained and surgically operated upon to sing but one perfect note each, are stimulated to more passionate efforts. Even the young emperor is moved by the sinister harmony of their song, which in few ways resembles anything previously uttered by the human voice. Why should their pain produce such marvelous beauty, he wonders? Or is all beauty created through pain? Is that the secret of great art, both human and Melnibonéan? The Emperor Elric closes his eyes. There is a stir in the hall below. The gates have opened and the dancing courtiers cease their motion, drawing back and bowing low as soldiers enter. The soldiers are clad all in light blue, their ornamental helms cast in fantastic shapes, their long, broad-bladed lances decorated with jeweled ribbons. They surround a young woman whose blue dress matches their uniforms, and whose bare arms are encircled by 5 or 6 bracelets of diamonds, sapphires, and gold. Strings of diamonds and sapphires are wound into her hair. Unlike most of the women of the court, her face has no designs painted upon the eyelids or cheekbones. Elric smiles. This is Cimmeril. The soldiers are her personal ceremonial guard, who, according to tradition, must escort her into the court. They ascend the steps leading to the ruby throne. Slowly Elric rises and stretches out his hands. Cimmeril, I thought you had decided not to grace the court tonight. She returns his smile. My Emperor, I found that I was in the mood for conversation after all. Elric is grateful. She knows that he is bored, and she knows, too, that she is one of the few people of Melniboné whose conversation interests him. If protocol allowed, he would offer her the throne, but as it is, she must sit on the topmost step at his feet. Please sit, sweet Cimmeril. He resumes his place upon the throne and leans forward as she seats herself and looks into his eyes, with a mixed expression of humor and tenderness. She speaks softly as her guard withdraws to mingle at the sides of the steps with Elric's own guard. Her voice can only be heard by Elric. Would you ride out to the wild region of the island with me tomorrow, my lord? There are matters to which I must give my attention. He is attracted by the idea. It is weeks since he left the city and rode with her, their escort keeping a discreet distance away. Are they urgent? What matters are urgent in Melniboné? After 10,000 years, most problems may be seen in a certain perspective. His smile is almost a grin, rather like that of a young scholar who plans to play truant from his tutor. Very well. Early in the morning we'll leave, before the others are up. The air beyond Imrir will be clear and sharp. The sun will be warm for the season. The sky will be blue and unclouded. Elric laughs. Such sorcery you must have worked. Cimmeril lowers her eyes and traces a pattern on the marble of the dais. Well, perhaps a little. I am not without friends among the weakest of the elementals. Elric stretches down to touch her fine, fair hair. Does Irkun know? No. Prince Irkun has forbidden his sister to meddle in magical matters. Prince Irkun's friends are only among the darker of the supernatural beings, and he knows that they are dangerous to deal with. Thus he assumes that all sorcerous dealings bear a similar element of danger. Besides this, he hates to think that others possess the power that he possesses. Perhaps this is what, in Elric, he hates most of all. Let us hope that all Melniboné needs fine weather for tomorrow, said Elric. Cimmeril stares curiously at him. She is still a Melniboné, and it has not occurred to her that her sorcery might prove unwelcome to some. Then she shrugs her lovely shoulders and touches her lord lightly upon the hand. This guilt, this searching of the conscience, its purpose is beyond my simple brain. And mine, I must admit. It seems to have no practical function, yet more than one of our ancestors predicted a change in the nature of our earth, a spiritual as well as physical change. Perhaps I have glimmerings of this change when I think my stranger un-Melnibonéan thoughts. The music swells, the music fades. The courtiers dance on, though many eyes are upon Elric and Cimmeril as they talk at the top of the dais. There is speculation. When will Elric announce Cimmeril as his empress-to-be? Will Elric revive the custom that Sadric dismissed of sacrificing 12 brides and their bridegrooms to the lords of chaos in order to ensure a good marriage for the rulers of Melniboné? It was obvious that Sadric's refusal to allow the custom to continue brought misery upon him and death upon his wife, brought him a sickly son, and threatened the very continuity of the monarchy. Elric must revive this custom. Even Elric must fear a repetition of the doom which visited his father. But some say that Elric will do nothing in accordance with tradition, and that he threatens not only his own life, but the existence of Melniboné itself and all it stands for. And those who speak thus are often seen to be on good terms with Prince Irkun, who dances on, seemingly unaware of their conversation, or indeed unaware that his sister talks quietly with the cousin who sits on the ruby throne, who sits on the edge of the seat, forgetful of his dignity, who exhibits none of the ferocious and disdainful pride which has, in the past, marked virtually every other emperor of Melniboné, who chats animatedly, forgetful that the court is supposed to be dancing for his entertainment. And then suddenly Prince Irkun freezes in mid-pirouette and raises his dark eyes to look up at his emperor. In one corner of the hall, Divam Tavar's attention is attracted by Irkun's calculated and dramatic posture, and the Lord of the Dragon Caves frowns. His hand falls to where his sword would normally be, but no swords are worn at a court ball. Divam Tavar looks warily and intently at Prince Irkun as the tall nobleman begins to ascend the stairs to the ruby throne. Many eyes follow the emperor's cousin, and now hardly anyone dances, though the music grows wilder, as the masters of the music's slaves goad their charges to even greater exertions. Elric looks up to see Irkun standing one step below that on which Cimmerl sits. Irkun makes a bow which is subtly insulting. "I present myself to my emperor." "And how do you enjoy the ball, cousin?" Elric asked, aware that Irkun's melodramatic presentation had been designed to catch him off guard and, if possible, humiliate him. "Is the music to your taste?" Irkun lowered his eyes and let his lips form a secret little smile. "Everything is to my taste, my liege. But what of yourself? Does something displease you? You do not join the dance." Elric raised one pale finger to his chin and stared at Irkun's hidden eyes. "I enjoy the dance, cousin, nonetheless. Surely it is possible to take pleasure in the pleasure of others." Irkun seemed genuinely astonished. His eyes opened fully and met Elric's. Elric felt a slight shock and then turned his own gaze away, indicating the music galleries with a languid hand. "Or perhaps it is the pain of others which brings me pleasure. Fear not for my sake, cousin. I am pleased. I am pleased. You may dance on, assured that your emperor enjoys the ball." But Irkun was not to be diverted from his object. Surely, if his subjects are not to go away saddened and troubled that they have not pleased their ruler, the emperor should demonstrate his enjoyment. "I would remind you, cousin, that the emperor has no duty to his subjects at all, save to rule them. Their duty is to him. That is the tradition of Melniboné." Irkun had not expected Elric to use such arguments against him, but he rallied with his next retort. "I agree, my lord. The emperor's duty is to rule his subjects. Perhaps that is why so many of them do not themselves enjoy the ball as much as they might." "I do not follow you, cousin." Cimmerl had risen and stood with her hands clenched on the step above her brother. She was tense and anxious, worried by her brother's bantering tone, his disdainful bearing. "Irkun," he acknowledged her presence. "Sister, I see you share our emperor's reluctance to dance." "Irkun, you are going too far. The emperor is tolerant, but—" "Tolerant? Or is he careless? Is he careless of the traditions of our great race? Is he contemptuous of that race's pride?" Divam Tavar was now mounting the steps. It was plain that he, too, sensed that Irkun had chosen this moment to test Elric's power. Cimmerl was aghast. She said urgently, "Irkun, if you would live—" "I would not care to live if the soul of Melniboné perished, and the guardianship of our nation's soul is the responsibility of the emperor. And what if we should have an emperor who failed in that responsibility, an emperor who was weak, An emperor who cared nothing for the greatness of the Dragon Isle and its folk? A hypothetical question, cousin. Elric had recovered his composure, and his voice was an icy drawl. For such an emperor has never sat upon the ruby throne, and such an emperor never shall. Divim Tavar came up, touching Irkun on the shoulder. Prince, if you value your dignity and your life... Elric raised his hand. There is no need for that, Divim Tavar. Prince Irkun merely entertains us with an intellectual debate, fearing that I was bored by the music and the dance, which I am not. He thought he would provide the subject for a stimulating discourse. I am certain that we are most stimulated, Prince Irkun. Elric allowed a patronizing warmth to color his last sentence. Irkun flushed with anger and bit his lip. But go on, dear cousin Irkun. I am interested. Enlarge further on your argument. Irkun looked around him as if for support, but all his supporters were on the floor of the hall. Only Elric's friends, Divim Tavar and Cimmerl, were nearby. Yet Irkun knew that his supporters were hearing every word, and that he would lose face if he did not retaliate. Elric could tell that Irkun would have preferred to have retired from this confrontation and choose another day and another ground on which to continue the battle, but that was not possible. Elric himself had no wish to continue the foolish banter, which was, no matter how disguised, a little better than the quarreling of two little girls over who should play with the slaves first. He decided to make an end to it. Irkun began, Then let me suggest that an emperor who was physically weak might also be weak in his will to rule, as befitted... And Elric raised his hand. You have done enough, dear cousin. More than enough. You have wearied yourself with this conversation when you would have preferred to dance. I am touched by your concern, but now I, too, feel weariness steal upon me. Elric signaled for his old servant Tanglebones, who stood on the far side of the throne dais among the soldiers. Tanglebones, my cloak. Elric stood up. I thank you again for your thoughtfulness, cousin. He addressed the court in general. I was entertained. Now I retire. Tanglebones brought the cloak of white fox fur and placed it around his master's shoulders. Tanglebones was very old and much taller than Elric, though his back was stooped and all his limbs seemed knotted and twisted back on themselves, like the limbs of a strong old tree. Elric walked across the dais and through the door, which opened onto a corridor which led to his private apartments. Irkun was left fuming. He whirled around on the dais and opened his mouth as if to address the watching courtiers. Some who did not support him were smiling quite openly. Irkun clenched his fists at his sides and glowered. He glared at Divim Tavar and opened his thin lips to speak. Divim Tavar coolly returned the glare, daring Irkun to say more. Then Irkun flung back his head so that the locks of his hair, all curled and oiled, swayed against his back, and Irkun laughed. The harsh sound filled the hall. The music stopped. The laughter continued. Irkun stepped up so that he stood on the dais. He dragged his heavy cloak round him so that it engulfed his body. Cimmerl came forward. Irkun, please do not. He pushed her back with a motion of his shoulder. Irkun walked stiffly towards the ruby throne. It became plain that he was about to seat himself in it, and thus perform one of the most traitorous actions possible in the code of Melniboné. Cimmerl ran the few steps to him and pulled at his arm. Irkun's laughter grew. It is Irkun they would wish to see on the ruby throne, he told his sister. She gasped and looked in horror at Divim Tavar, whose face was grim and angry. Divim Tavar signed to the guards, and suddenly there were two ranks of armored men between Irkun and the throne. Irkun glared back at the Lord of the Dragon Caves. You had best hope you perish with your master. This guard of honor will escort you from the hall, Divim Tavar said evenly. We were all stimulated by your conversation this evening, Prince Irkun. Irkun paused, looked about him, then relaxed. He shrugged. There's time enough. If Elric will not abdicate, then he must be deposed. Cimmeral's slender body was rigid, her eyes blazed. She said to her brother, If you harm Elric in any way, I will slay you myself, Irkun. He raised his tapering eyebrows and smiled. At that moment he seemed to hate his sister even more than he hated his cousin. Your loyalty to that creature has ensured your own doom, Cimmeral. I would rather you died than that you should give birth to any progeny of his. I will not have the blood of our house diluted, tainted, even touched by his blood. Look to your own life, sister, before you threaten mine. And he stormed down the steps, pushing through those who came up to congratulate him. He knew that he had lost, and the murmurs of his sycophants only irritated him further. The great doors of the hall crashed together and closed. Irkun was gone. Divam Tavar raised both his arms. Dance on, courtiers! Pleasure yourselves with all that the hall provides. It is what will please the Emperor most. But it was plain there would be little more dancing done tonight. Courtiers were already deep in conversation as excitedly they debated the events. Divam Tavar turned to Cimmeral. Elric refuses to understand the danger, Princess Cimmeral. Irkun's ambition could bring disaster to all of us. Including Irkun. Aye, including Irkun. But how can we avoid this, Cimmeral, if Elric will not give orders for your brother's arrest? He believes that such as Irkun should be allowed to say what they please. It's part of his philosophy. I can barely understand it, but it seems integral to his whole belief. If he destroys Irkun, he destroys the basis on which his logic works. That, at any rate, Dragon Master, is what he has tried to explain to me. Divam Tavar sighed, and he frowned. Though unable to understand Elric, he was afraid that he could sometimes sympathize with Irkun's viewpoint. At least Irkun's motives and arguments were relatively straightforward. He knew Elric's character too well, however, to believe that Elric acted from weakness or lassitude. The paradox was that Elric tolerated Irkun's treachery because he was strong, because he had the power to destroy Irkun whenever he cared. And Irkun's own character was such that he must constantly be testing that strength of Elric's, for he knew instinctively that if Elric did weaken and order him slain, then he would have won. It was a complicated situation, and Divam Tavar dearly wished that he was not embroiled in it. But his loyalty to the royal line of Melniboné was strong, and his personal loyalty to Elric was great. He considered the idea of having Irkun secretly assassinated, but he knew that such a plan would almost certainly come to nothing. Irkun was a sorcerer of immense power, and doubtless would be forewarned of any attempt on his life. Princess Cimmeral, I can only pray that your brother swallows so much of his rage that it eventually poisons him. I will join you in that prayer, Lord of the Dragon Caves. Together, they left the hall. The light of the early morning touched the tall towers of Imrir and made them scintillate. Each tower was of a different hue. There were 1,000 soft colors. There were rose pinks and pollen yellows. There were purples and pale greens, mauves and browns and oranges, hazy blues, whites and powdery golds, all lovely in the sunlight. 2 riders left the dreaming city behind them and rode away from the walls, over the green turf towards a pine forest, where among the shadowy trunks a little of the night seemed to remain. Squirrels were stirring and foxes crept homeward. Birds were singing, and forest flowers opened their petals and filled the air with delicate scent. A few insects wandered sluggishly aloft. The contrast between life in the nearby city and this lazy rusticity was very great, and seemed to mirror some of the contrasts existing in the mind of at least one of the riders, who now dismounted and led his horse walking knee-deep through a mass of blue flowers. The other rider, a girl, brought her own horse to a halt but did not dismount. Instead, she leaned casually on her high Melnibonéan pommel and smiled at the man, her lover. "Elric, would you stop so near to Imrir?" He smiled back at her over his shoulder. "For the moment. Our flight was hasty. I would collect my thoughts before we ride on." "How did you sleep last night?" "Well enough, Cymril, although I must have dreamed without knowing it, for there were little intimations in my head when I awoke. But then the meeting with Irkun was not pleasant." "Do you think he plots to use sorcery against you?" Elric shrugged. "I would know if he brought a large sorcery against me. And he knows my power. I doubt if he would dare employ wizardry." "He has reason to believe you might not use your power. He has worried at your personality for so long. Is there not a danger he will begin to worry at your skills, testing your sorcery, as he has tested your patience?" Elric frowned. "Yes, I suppose there is that danger. But not yet, I should have thought." "He will not be happy until you are destroyed, Elric." "Oh, or is destroyed himself, Cymril." Elric stooped and picked up one of the flowers. He smiled. "Your brother is inclined to absolutes, is he not? How the weak hate weakness." Cymril took his meaning. She dismounted and came towards him. Her thin gown matched almost perfectly the color of the flowers through which she moved. He handed her the flower, and she accepted it, touching its petals with her perfect lips. "And how the strong hate strength, my love. Irkun is my kin, and yet I give you this advice: use your strength against him." "I could not slay him. I have not the right." Elric's face fell into familiar, brooding lines. "You could exile him." "Is not exile the same as death to a Melnibonéan? You yourself have talked of traveling in the lands of the young kingdoms." Elric laughed somewhat bitterly. "But perhaps I am not a true Melnibonéan. Irkun has said as much, and others echo his thoughts." "He hates you because you are contemplative. Your father was contemplative, and no one denied that he was a fitting emperor." "My father chose not to put the results of his contemplation into his personal actions. He ruled as an emperor should. Irkun, I must admit, would also rule as an emperor should. He, too, has the opportunity to make Melniboné great again. If he were emperor, he would embark on a campaign of conquest to restore our trade to its former volume, to extend our power across the earth. And that is what the majority of our folk would wish. Is it my right to deny that wish?" "It is your right to do what you think, for you are the emperor. All who are loyal to you think as I do." "Perhaps their loyalty is misguided. Perhaps Irkun is right, and I will betray that loyalty, bring down the Dragon Isle." His moody crimson eyes looked directly into hers. "Perhaps I should have died as I left my mother's womb. Then Irkun would have become emperor. Has fate been thwarted?" "Fate is never thwarted. What has happened because fate willed it thus, if indeed there is such a thing as fate, and if men's actions are not merely response to other men's actions." Elric drew a deep breath and offered her an expression tinged with irony. "Your logic leads close to heresy, Cymril, if we are to believe the traditions of Melniboné. Perhaps it would be better if you forgot your friendship with me." She laughed. "You begin to sound like my brother. Are you testing my love for you, my lord? He began to remount his horse. "No, Cymril, but I would advise you to test your love yourself, for I sense there is tragedy implicit in our love." As she swung herself back into her saddle, she smiled and shook her head. "You see doom in all things. Can you not accept the good gifts granted you? They are few enough, my lord." "Aye, I'll agree with that." They turned in their saddles, hearing hoofbeats behind them. Some distance away they saw a company of yellow-clad horsemen riding about in confusion. It was their guard, which they had left behind, wishing to ride alone. "Come, through the woods and over yonder hill, and they'll never find us." They spurred their steeds through the sun-speared wood and up the steep sides of the hill beyond, racing down the other side and away across a plain where noidal bushes grew, their lush, poison fruit glimmering a purplish blue, a night color which even the light of day could not disperse. There were many such peculiar berries and herbs on Melniboné, and it was to some of them that Elric owed his life. Others were used for sorcerous potions, and had been sown generations before by Elric's ancestors. Now few Melnibonéans left Imrir even to collect these harvests. Only slaves visited the greater part of the island, seeking the roots and shrubs which made men dream monstrous and magnificent dreams. For it was in their dreams that the nobles of Melniboné found most of their pleasure. They had ever been a moody, inward-looking race, and it was for this quality that Imrir had come to be named the Dreaming City. There, even the meanest slaves chewed berries to bring them oblivion, and thus were easily controlled, for they came to depend on their dreams. Only Elric himself refused such drugs, perhaps because he required so many others simply to ensure his remaining alive. The yellow-clad guards were lost behind them, and once across the plain where the noidal bushes grew, they slowed their flight, and came at length to cliffs and then the sea. The sea shone brightly, and languidly washed the white beaches below the cliffs. Seabirds wheeled in the clear sky, and their cries were distant, serving only to emphasize the sense of peace which both Elric and Cymril now had. In silence the lovers guided their horses down steep paths to the shore, and there they tethered the steeds and began to walk across the sand, their hair his white, hers jet black, waving in the wind which blew from the east. They found a great dry cave which caught the sounds the sea made and replied in a whispering echo. They removed their silken garments and made love tenderly in the shadows of the cave. They lay in each other's arms as the day warmed and the wind dropped. Then they went to bathe in the waters, filling the empty sky with their laughter. When they were dry and were dressing themselves, they noticed a darkening of the horizon, and Elric said, "We shall be wet again before we return to Imrir. No matter how fast we ride, the storm will catch us." "Perhaps we should remain in the cave until it is past," she suggested, coming close and holding her soft body against him. "No, I must return soon, for there are potions in Imrir I must take if my body is to retain its strength. An hour or two longer, and I shall begin to weaken. You have seen me weak before, Cymril." She stroked his face, and her eyes were sympathetic. I've seen you weak before, Elric. Come, let's find the horses." By the time they reached the horses, the sky was gray overhead, and full of boiling blackness not far away in the east. They heard the grumble of thunder and the crash of lightning. The sea was threshing as if infected by the sky's hysteria. The horses snorted and pawed at the sand, anxious to return. Even as Elric and Cymril climbed into their saddles, large spots of rain began to fall on their heads and spread over their cloaks. Then suddenly they were riding at full tilt back to Imrir, while the lightning flashed around them and the thunder roared like a furious giant, like some great old lord of chaos attempting to break through, unbidden, into the realm of earth. Cymril glanced at Elric's pale face, illuminated for a moment by a flash of sky-fire, and she felt a chill come upon her then, and the chill had nothing to do with the wind or the rain, for it seemed to her that in that second that the gentle scholar she loved had been transformed by the elements into a hell-driven demon, into a monster with barely a semblance of humanity. His crimson eyes had flared from the whiteness of his skull like the very flames of the higher hell. His hair had been whipped upward so that it had become the crest of a sinister war helm, and, by a trick of the stormlight, his mouth had seemed twisted in a mixture of rage and agony. And suddenly, Cymril knew. She knew profoundly that their morning's ride was the last moment of peace the two of them would ever experience again. The storm was a sign from the gods themselves, a warning of storms to come. She looked again at her lover. Elric was laughing. He had turned his face upward so that the warm rain fell upon it, so that the water splashed into his open mouth. The laughter was the easy, unsophisticated laughter of a happy child. Cymril tried to laugh back, but then she had to turn her face away so that he should not see it, for Cymril had begun to weep. She was weeping still when Imrir came in sight, a black and grotesque silhouette against a line of brightness which was the as yet untainted western horizon. The men in yellow armor saw Elric and Cymril as the two approached the smallest of the eastern gates. "They have found us at last," smiled Elric through the rain, but somewhat belatedly. Cymril? Cymril, still embattled with her sense of doom, merely nodded and tried to smile in reply. Elric took this as an expression of disappointment, nothing more, and called to his guards, "Ho, men! Soon we shall all be dry again." But the captain of the guard rode up urgently, crying, "My Lord Emperor is needed at Monshennik Tower, where spies are held." "Spies?" "Aye, my lord." The man's face was pale. Water cascaded from his helm and darkened his thin cloak. His horse was hard to control and kept sidestepping through pools of water which had gathered wherever the road was in disrepair. "Caught in the maze this morning, southern barbarians by their checkered dress. We are holding them until the Emperor himself can question them." Elric waved his hand. "Then lead on, Captain. Let's see the brave fools who dare Melniboné's sea maze." The Tower of Monshennik had been named for the wizard architect who had designed the sea maze millennia before. The maze was the only means of reaching the great harbor of Imrir, and its secrets had been carefully guarded, for it was their greatest protection against sudden attack. The maze was complicated, and pilots had to be specially trained to steer ships through it. Before the maze had been built, the harbor had been a kind of inland lagoon, fed by the sea, which swept in through a system of natural caverns in the towering cliff which rose between lagoon and ocean. There were 5 separate routes through the sea maze, and any individual pilot knew but one. In the outer wall of the cliff, there were 5 entrances. Here, young kingdom ships waited until a pilot came aboard. Then one of the gates to one of the entrances would be lifted. All aboard the ship would be blindfolded and sent below, save for the oarmaster and the steersman, who would also be masked in heavy steel helms so that they could see nothing, do nothing, but obey the complicated instructions of the pilot. And if a young kingdom ship should fail to obey any of those instructions and should crush itself against the rock walls, well, Melniboné did not mourn for it, and any survivors from the crew would be taken as slaves. All who sought to trade with the dreaming city understood the risks, but scores of merchants came every month to dare the dangers of the maze and trade their own poor goods for the splendid riches of Melniboné. The tower of Monshennik stood overlooking the harbor and the massive mole which jutted out into the middle of the lagoon. It was a sea-green tower and was squat compared with most of those in Imrir, though still a beautiful and tapering construction, with wide windows, so that the whole of the harbor could be seen from it. From Monchagnac Tower, most of the business of the harbor was done, and in its lower cellars were kept any prisoners who had broken any of the myriad rules governing the function of the harbor. Leaving Cymril to return to the palace with a guard, Elric entered the tower, riding through the great archway at the base, scattering not a few merchants who were waiting for permission to begin their bartering, for the whole of the ground floor was full of sailors, merchants, and Melnibonéan officials engaged in the business of trade, though it was not here that the actual wares were displayed. The great echoing babble of 1,000 voices engaged in 1,000 separate aspects of bargaining slowly stilled as Elric and his guard rode arrogantly through to another dark arch at the far end of the hall. This arch opened onto a ramp which sloped and curved down into the bowels of the tower. Down this ramp clattered the horsemen, passing slaves, servants, and officials who stepped hastily aside, bowing low as they recognized the Emperor. Great brands illuminated the tunnel, guttering and smoking, and casting distorted shadows onto the smooth obsidian walls. A chill was in the air now, and a dampness, for water washed about the outer walls beyond the quays of Imrir. And still the Emperor rode on, and still the ramp struck lower through the glassy rock. And then a wave of heat rose to meet them, and shifting light could be seen ahead, and they passed into a chamber that was full of smoke and the scent of fear. From the low ceiling hung chains, and from 8 of the chains, swinging by their feet, hung 4 people. Their clothes had been torn from them, but their bodies were clothed in blood from tiny wounds, precise but severe, made by the artist who stood, scalpel in hand, surveying his handiwork. The artist was tall and very thin, almost like a skeleton in his stained white garments. His lips were thin, his eyes were slits, his fingers were thin, his hair was thin, and the scalpel he held was thin too, almost invisible, save when it flashed in the light from the fire, which erupted from a pit on the far side of the cavern. The artist was named Dr. Jest, and the art he practiced was a performing art rather than a creative one, though he could argue otherwise with some conviction. The art of drawing secrets from those who kept them. Dr. Jest was the chief interrogator of Melniboné. He turned sinuously as Elric entered, the scalpel held between the thin thumb and the thin forefinger of his right hand. He stood poised and expectant, almost like a dancer, and then bowed from the waist. "My sweet Emperor!" His voice was thin. It rushed from his thin throat as if bent on escape, and one was inclined to wonder if one had heard the words at all, so quickly had they come and gone. "Doctor, are these the Southlanders caught this morning?"
"Indeed they are, my lord."
Another sinuous bow.
"For your pleasure."
Coldly Elric inspected the prisoners. He felt no sympathy for them. They were spies. Their actions had led them to this pass. They had known what would happen to them if caught. But one of them was a boy, and another a woman, it appeared. Though they writhed so in their chains, it was difficult to tell at first. It seemed a shame. Then the woman snapped what remained of her teeth at him and hissed, "Demon!" And Elric stepped back, saying, "Have they informed you of what they were doing in our maze, Doctor?"
"They still tantalize me with hints. They have a fine sense of drama. I appreciate that. They are here, I would say, to map a route through the maze, which a force of raiders might then follow. But they have, so far, withheld the details. That is the game. We all understand how it must be played."
"And when will they tell you, Dr. Jest?"
"Oh, very soon, my lord."
"It would be best to know if we are to expect attackers. The sooner we know, the less time we shall lose dealing with the attack when it comes. Do you not agree, Doctor?"
"I do, my lord."
"Very well." Elric was irritated by this break in his day. It had spoiled the pleasure of the ride. It had brought him face to face with his duties too quickly. Dr. Jest returned to his charges, and, reaching out with his free hand, expertly seized the genitals of one of the male prisoners. The scalpel flashed. There was a groan. Dr. Jest tossed something onto the fire. Elric sat in the chair prepared for him. He was bored rather than disgusted by the rituals attendant upon the gathering of information, and the discordant screams, the clash of chains, the thin whisperings of Dr. Jest, all served to ruin the feeling of well-being he had retained even as he reached the chamber. But it was one of his kingly duties to attend such rituals, and attend this one he must, until the information was presented to him, and he could congratulate his chief interrogator, and issue orders as to the means of dealing with any attack. And even when that was over, he must confer with admirals and with generals, probably through the rest of the night, choosing between arguments, deciding on the deposition of men and ships. With a poorly disguised yawn, he leaned back and watched as Dr. Jest ran fingers and scalpel, tongue, tongs, and pincers over the bodies. He was soon thinking of other matters, philosophical problems, which he had still failed to resolve. It was not that Elric was inhumane. It was that he was still a Melnibonéan. He had been used to such sights since childhood. He could not have saved the prisoners, even if he had desired, without going against every tradition of the Dragon Isle. And, in this case, it was a simple matter of a threat being met by the best methods available. He'd become used to shutting off those feelings which conflicted with his duties as Emperor. If there had been any point in freeing the four who danced now at Dr. Jest's pleasure, he would have freed them. But there was no point, and the four would have been astonished if they had received any other treatment than this. Where moral decisions were concerned, Elric was, by and large, practical. He would make his decision in the context of what action he could take. In this case, he could take no action. Such a reaction had become second nature to him. His desire was not to reform Melniboné, but to reform himself. Not to initiate action, but to know the best way of responding to the actions of others. Here the decision was easy to make. A spy was an aggressor. One defended oneself against aggressors in the best possible way. The methods employed by Dr. Jest were the best methods.
"My lord?"
Absently, Elric looked up.
"We have the information now, my lord."
Dr. Jest's thin voice whispered across the chamber. 2 sets of chains were now empty, and slaves were gathering things up from the floor and flinging them on the fire. The 2 remaining shapeless lumps reminded Elric of meat, carefully prepared by a chef. One of the lumps still quivered a little, but the other was still. Dr. Jest slid his instruments into a thin case he carried in a pouch at his belt. His white garments were almost completely covered in stains.
"It seems there have been other spies before these. These came merely to confirm the route. If they do not return in time, the barbarians will still sail."
"But surely they will know that we expect them."
"Probably not, my lord. Rumors have been spread amongst the young kingdom merchants and sailors that 4 spies were seen in the maze and were speared, slain, whilst trying to escape."
"I see. Then our best plan will be to lay a trap for the raiders."
"Aye, my lord."
"You know the route they have chosen?"
"Aye, my lord."
Elric turned to one of his guards. "Have messages sent to all our generals and admirals. What's the hour?"
"The hour of sunset is just past, my liege."
"Tell them to assemble before the Ruby Throne at 2 hours past sunset." Wearily, Elric rose. "You have done well, as usual, Dr. Jest." The thin artist bowed low, seeming to fold himself in 2. A thin and somewhat unctuous sigh was his reply. Yirkun was the first to arrive, all clad in martial finery, accompanied by 2 massive guards, each holding one of the prince's ornate war banners. "My emperor!" Yirkun's shout was proud and disdainful.
Would you let me command the warriors? It will relieve you of that care when, doubtless, you have many other concerns with which to occupy your time." Elric replied impatiently, "You are most thoughtful, Prince Irkun, but fear not for me. I shall command the armies and the navies of Melniboné, for that is the duty of the Emperor." Irkun glowered and stepped to one side as Daivim Tavar, Lord of the Dragon Caves, entered. He had no guard whatsoever with him, and it seemed he had dressed hastily. He carried his helmet under his arm. "My Emperor, I bring news of the dragons." "I thank you, Daivim Tavar, but wait until all my commanders are assembled, and impart that news to them, too." Daivim Tavar bowed, and went to stand on the opposite side of the hall to that on which Prince Irkun stood. Gradually the warriors arrived until a score of great captains waited at the foot of the steps which led to the ruby throne where Elric sat. Elric himself still wore the clothes in which he had gone riding that morning. He had not had time to change, and had, until a little while before, been consulting maps of the maze, maps which only he could read, and which, at normal times, were hidden by magical means from any who might attempt to find them. "Southlanders would steal Imrir's wealth and slay us all," Elric began. "They believe they've found a way through our sea maze. A fleet of 100 warships sails on Melniboné even now. Tomorrow it will wait below the horizon until dusk. Then it will sail to the maze and enter. By midnight it expects to reach the harbor and to have taken the dreaming city before dawn. Is that possible, I wonder?" "No." Many spoke the single word. "No." Elric smiled. "But how shall we best enjoy this little war they offer us?" Irkun, as ever, was the first to shout. "Let us go meet them now, with dragons and with battle barges. Let us pursue them to their own land and take their war to them. Let us attack their nations and burn their cities. Let us conquer them and thus ensure our own security." Daivim Tavar spoke up again. "No dragons," he said. "What?" Irkun whirled. "What?" "No dragons, Prince. They will not be awakened. The dragons sleep in their caverns, exhausted by their last engagement on your behalf." "Mine?" "You had us use them in our conflict with the Vilmirian pirates. I told you that I would prefer to save them for a larger engagement, but you flew them against the pirates and you burned their little boats, and now the dragons sleep." Irkun glowered. He looked up at Elric. "I did not expect—" Elric raised his hand. "We need not use our dragons until such a time as we really need them. This attack from the Southlander fleet is nothing. But we will conserve our strength if we bide our time. Let them think we are unready. Let them enter the maze. Once the whole 100 are through, we close in, blocking off all routes in or out of the maze. Trapped, they will be crushed by us." Irkun looked pettishly at his feet, evidently wishing he could think of some flaw in the plan. Tall old Admiral Makum Kolim in his sea-green armor stepped forward and bowed. "The golden battle barges of Imrir are ready to defend their city, my liege. It will take time, however, to maneuver them into position. It is doubtful if all will fit into the maze at once." "Then sail some of them out now and hide them around the coast, so that they can wait for any survivors that may escape our attack," Elric instructed him. "A useful plan, my liege." Makum Kolim bowed and sank back into the crowd of his peers. The debate continued for some time, and then they were ready and about to leave. But then Prince Irkun bellowed once more. "I repeat my offer to the Emperor. His person is too valuable to risk in battle. My person, it is worthless. Let me command the warriors of both land and sea, while the Emperor may remain at the palace, untroubled by the battle, confident that it will be won and the Southlanders trounced. Perhaps there is a book he wishes to finish." Elric smiled. "Again, I thank you for your concern, Prince Irkun, but an emperor must exercise his body as well as his mind. I will command the warriors tomorrow." When Elric arrived back at his apartments, it was to discover that Tanglebones had already laid out his heavy, black war gear. Here was the armor which had served 100 Melnibonéan emperors, an armor which is forged by sorcery to give it a strength unequaled on the realm of earth, which could, so rumor went, even withstand the bite of the mythical rune blades, Stormbringer and Mournblade, which had been wielded by the wickedest of Melniboné's many wicked rulers, before being seized by the lords of the higher worlds and hidden forever in a realm where even those lords might rarely venture. The face of the tangled man was full of joy as he touched each piece of armor, each finely balanced weapon, with his long, gnarled fingers. His seamed face looked up to regard Elric's care-ravaged features. "Oh, my lord! Oh, my king! Soon you will know the joy of the fight." "Aye, Tanglebones, and let us hope it will be a joy." "I taught you all the skills, the art of the sword and the poniard, the art of the bow, the art of the spear, both mounted and on foot, and you learned well, for they all say you are weak. Save one, there's no better swordsman in Melniboné." "Prince Irkun could be better than me," Elric said reflectively. "Could he not?" "I said, save one, my lord." "And Irkun is that one. Well, one day perhaps we'll be able to test the matter. I'll bathe before I don all that metal." "Best make speed, master. From what I hear, there is much to do." "And I'll sleep after I've bathed." Elric smiled at his old friend's consternation. "It will be better thus, for I cannot personally direct the barges into position. I am needed to command the fray, and that I will do better when I've rested." "If you think it good, Lord King, then it is good." "And you are astonished. You are too eager, Tanglebones, to get me into all that stuff and see me strut about in it as if I were Eriach himself." Tanglebones' hands flew to his mouth, as if he had spoken the words, not his master, and he was trying to block them. His eyes widened. Elric laughed. "You think I speak bold heresies, eh? Well, I've spoken worse without any ill befalling me. On Melniboné, Tanglebones, the emperors controlled the demons, not the reverse." "So you say, my liege." "It is the truth." Elric swept from the room, calling for his slaves. The war fever filled him, and he was jubilant.